Fighters from the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant gain more ground, vowing to march on Baghdad. So how will the deteriorating security situation in Iraq affect its neighbours? And is foreign intervention a possibility? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. Iraq under siege. Fighters from the hardline armed group Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant have seized the city of Tikrit. That's about 130 kilometers from the capital, Baghdad. It's their second major gain in as many days. On Tuesday, they took control of Iraq's second city of Mosul, forcing as many as 500,000 people to flee. But as Iraq unravels into chaos, what lies ahead for the region? Iraq's neighbours are considering their options. Turkey is holding urgent discussions about how to respond to the kidnapping of its citizens from its consulate in Mosul. The government has warned of harsh retaliation if any of its citizens are armed. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani says his country will not tolerate what he calls violence and terror, but provided no further details about any possible action. Iraq's Prime Minister has long accused Qatar and Saudi Arabia of supporting fighters in Iraq as part of what he calls a sectarian agenda. There's no indication yet as to how the Gulf powers will react to the current situation. The greatest immediate impact, though, likely to be on Syria. Already in the midst of a civil war, any spillover from the latest developments in Iraq are certain to fuel further conflict in that three-year-old crisis. Well, at this particular stage, let's bring in our guests. In Ankara, we have Haldun Solmaz-Türk, a retired brigadier general of the Turkish army. In Beirut, Robin Fisk, foreign correspondent for the independent newspaper. And in Washington, D.C., David Pollock. He's a fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Welcome to you all. Well, these events are unraveling quickly. Let's begin in Turkey, where the government is huddling and dealing with the immediate threat of its citizens being held hostage. Haldun Solmaz-Türk, of course, a serious situation being discussed, is it not?
Yes, this is a very unwelcome development from Turkish perspective, because obviously Turkish government did not expect this. And so it looks as if somebody threw a piece of cake to the fan, and the government seems to be in panic. And particularly because the political opposition only a few days ago warned the government of the possibility of such a development, but they turned a deaf ear to this warning. And now they are trying to find a way out of this chaotic situation. Of course, about 50 citizens, Turkish citizens, including the consul himself and his family members, including children and women, makes the situation very, very sensitive. And I don't think Turkish government has many options to have a control over the situation there.
Robert Fisk, what options do you think, first of all, does the Turkish government have at this stage?
Well, the Turkish government is in very much the same position as the Pakistani government was when the Americans used the Pakistanis as an arms transit route for the Mujahideen fighting the Russians in the Russian war in Afghanistan. Turkey is today's Pakistan on the border of Syria. And Turkey's position now is extremely grave because its border has already become an arms and money transit route, not only for its allies, but also for some of the more Islamists of its so-called allies, including ISIS, of course, who are in Syria and Iraq. I think there's one point, Mike, that we need to realize. This war in Iraq is not going to spill over into Syria because it's exactly the same war. The town of the Syrian city of Raqqa, which is totally in the hands of the Islamist international jihadis, is in exactly the same position as the city of Mosul and now Tikrit. They are the same people, they are ISIS. And the Syrian-Iraqi border has no meaning anymore. The Syrian-Iraqi war, that is the war. There's no spilling over from one side to the other.
Well, important point that, David Pollock, the whole fact that the borders have now been altered, the battlefield, as Robert Fisk is pointing out there, has been enlarged.
Yes, I think that's correct. I think that the Turkish government has recently and belatedly made more serious efforts to try to control its border with both Syria and Iraq and to crack down on some of the worst jihadi groups. But it's a bit late in the day. And from what I understand, in practice, they're not able to control the border. The Syrian and Iraqi border has practically disappeared. And the one area that the border, I think, still works to a great extent is, and this is very important, is the border between the Kurdistan region inside Iraq and neighboring areas. So the Kurds and their military forces, the Peshmerga, have so far been able to defend their own territory and even to expand their reach into new parts of disputed territories in Iraq and keep ISIS away.
Well, Robert Fisk, on this particular point about Kurdistan itself, first of all, what kind of role could Kurdistan play in assisting Turkey in terms of resolving its initial crisis at the moment? There's a very strange dynamic going on here, is there not?
I don't know if it's that strange, actually, Mike. Poor old Kurds are always betrayed by everyone, by the Shah, by Kissinger, by Saddam, and they'll be betrayed again. If we can use them to counteract the jihadis in Iraq or indeed in Syria, we will, and we'll promise them the earth or even a Kurdish state, and in the end we will betray them. If the Kurds are wise, and they sometimes are when they're not feuding with each other, they'll stay out of this war, defend their own Kurdistan area, which is a kind of mini-state within Iraq. Remember that the Kurdish towns in Syria, in many cases, are already surrounded. They're under encirclement by the same ISIS people who are in Raqqa in Syria and in Mosul and in Tikrit and maybe going further south. I think in a sense, though, we're rather letting the jihadis tell us what's going on. You know, these people are quite sharp. When they say, oh, we're going on to Baghdad, we're going to go to Kerbala, which is unlikely since it's a totally Shiite city, they may well turn around and go for Aleppo again or go for Damascus. One of the things you have to remember, and this was borne home on me just 4.5 days ago, I was northeast of Aleppo with Syrian government troops on the front line looking east. I was actually on a little bit of the motorway to Raqqa, and in front of a huge earth revetment, which was the front line, was the motorway sign, Raqqa that way. And I realized, of course, that if I was on the other side, and I was Al-Qaeda, I would keep going almost as far as the Iranian border. We're talking now of a Qaeda jihadi group, funded mainly, by the way, by Saudi Arabia, which we haven't mentioned yet, our great ally, America's ally, Saudi Arabia, whose territory, thousands of square miles, now stretches from north of Aleppo, where you can smell the Mediterranean, to almost as far as the Iraqi-Iranian border. We're talking of people now who are interested in territory rather than suicide bombs in tube trains and tall buildings and hijacked planes.
We'll pick up on a particular point you made there in a moment, Robert, but I want to go to Haldun Solmaz-Türk, still on the issue of Turkey's involvement here. We're not only talking about them looking at hostages being held at the embassy. Of course, it's a major oil supply and gas supply route for Turkey, which is now under direct threat. We got the Baiji oil refinery being attacked at the moment. This, of course, is a major concern as well for Turkey in this situation.
Mike, I think we are looking at a very chaotic situation. There are conflicts in conflicts waged by various groups. As we generally know and recognize that there is a general realignment of forces and politics in the region along sectarian lines. And also there's another realignment of Kurdish forces in the region, political forces. There is an autonomous Kurdish administration in northern Iraq, but also now there are some Kurdish forces controlling parts of northern Syria. Besides, more important from Turkish perspective, there is an ongoing insurgency within Turkish borders for quite a long time. And as the Turkey is heading towards very critical presidential elections and general elections in coming months, the tension within Turkish borders are rising, along with tension in the region in general. The critical point from Turkish government perspective is that already the Turkish government has made itself allies of certain groups and enemies of some other groups. For example, the central Iraqi government are not in very good terms with the Turkish government for quite a long time, as is the central Syrian government. For example, the deputy president of vice president of Iraq, Tariq Hashemi, was sentenced to death, and he found a refuge in Turkey, and now he is in a sense talking as if he is congratulating these recent developments, in Mosul, in Tikrit, in somewhere else, and he describes the situation as the success or victory of so-called revolution. So it's very difficult. It's very complicated, complex situation, out of which neither Turkey or any other country alone can find a way out. I believe one needs to formulate a clear-cut strategy based on a clear-cut policy in cooperation with international community.
Well, let's just bring up what is an elephant in the room at this particular stage as well. Many are raising questions about whether the United States should step in to help Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki's government. He's reportedly asked the US to consider carrying out airstrikes against ISIL fighters. State Department spokesman Jen Psaki says Washington is committed to working with the Iraq government and leaders across Iraq to support a unified approach against ISIL's continued aggression. The US has completely ruled out sending troops back into Iraq, where around 4,500 American soldiers were killed. This was bluntly reaffirmed by Pentagon spokesman John Kirby, who insisted the US military would not get involved in the situation, adding, "This is for the Iraqi security forces and the Iraqi government to deal with it." Well, David Pollock, we've already heard at the United Nations, the Security Council, a very strong attack from Russia. Sergei Lavrov saying that this is a proof of the total failure of the US-led invasion. Already it is being used as a diplomatic weapon by countries such as Russia. What is the US's position in all of this?
The U.S. position, I think, is, as you said, that the United States is going to try to help the Iraqi government defend itself against these jihadis, but without direct U.S. military intervention. And I think that from the U.S. perspective, even more important than the internal situation in Iraq, however that turns out, is the security of U.S. friends on Iraq's borders, which means Turkey and Jordan, and ultimately also the Arab states in the Gulf, even though they're quite far from the current fighting in Iraq or Syria. So I would say that if there is a direct threat from ISIS or from other elements inside Iraq to the security of Jordan or of Turkey or of Saudi Arabia and other Gulf Arab states friendly to the U.S., that the U.S. might actually consider direct intervention of some kind. Not boots on the ground, as we say, but air support or missiles or drones.
Well, Robert Fisk, do you think that the US perhaps has what almost constitutes a duty here, having invaded Iraq, having supposedly set up a new Iraqi military to protect a constitutional democracy that the US said it ushered into being? Do you think that there is a responsibility, a duty of care that the US needs to exercise in terms of helping to resolve the situation?
The United States has no responsibilities at all in the Middle East, and a lot of Arabs are very happy about that, because essentially we're seeing an American withdrawal after the disaster in Afghanistan and the total failure in Iraq. What Americans have got, what Washington has to deal with, is an extremely interesting situation, and if one was cynical, one would say it was quite horrifying. On the one hand, you've got Nouri al-Maliki of Iraq, whom we are supposed to love, and he was elected, and he's our ally, and a Shiite, of course, and he's got to be supported in his war against the horrible jihadis. And then we've got Bashar al-Assad, who is now a brother in arms to Maliki, fighting exactly the same enemy, but we're still supposed to depose Bashar al-Assad, who had an election which we're not supposed to believe in, as opposed to Maliki, which had who did at least have a more reputable election. Now, over and above this, we've got our lovely ally, our moderate ally, Saudi Arabia, who loathes Iran, who's in real trouble now, of course, but which is funding. It's a major funder of the jihadis who are attacking Maliki, our ally, and Assad, supposedly our enemy, and yet at the same time the Saudis are the best friends of Washington. I think in the United States they better sit down and work out who their friends are and who their enemies are before they have any ideas of having duties in the Middle East.
Well, Holland Salzman-Turk, on that particular question, is Turkey clear about who its friends are and who its enemies are in resolving the current situation or attempting to approach the current situation?
No, I'm afraid. And I would differentiate between Turkey and the Turkish government. I think, I firmly believe that Turkish government needs a complete review, its policy, its regional policy, based on the lessons learned, very grave lessons learned during the course of last 10, 12 years. As a side comment, I cannot help but indicate that the United States has a moral responsibility to get involved and to do something to get this situation under control, not because it was the United States who started this in the first place, but also the United States is the only nation who can coordinate a concerted effort global-wide.
Well, David Pollard, your view on that particular thing is that somewhere in all of this, we've spoken about the complexities of the situation, but somewhere in all of this, perhaps somebody has to take a lead. We've already had NATO saying, wait, we are absolutely against this, but it has nothing to do with us. We are not going to be doing anything. Everybody expressing deep concern, which we will hear at the UN Security Council as well, of course. But surely somewhere in this, there has to be somebody taking at least pretending to take some kind of lead to coalesce all these various interested parties in dealing with what is an immense global crisis.
Yes, I think that's probably right. And actually, I think the United States has taken the lead in aspects of this crisis. For example, on the humanitarian front, we shouldn't forget that it's the United States that is paying hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of our own resources to support the flood of refugees from Syria and from Iraq over the years, and that it's the United States that protected the Kurdistan region of Iraq going all the way back more than 20 years ago to the aftermath of the Gulf War, in which we liberated Kuwait from Iraq. So the United States has done some very important and positive things in this region over the years, in addition to some of the mistakes that we've made. Now, today, I think the United States does have an interest, never mind the issue of moral responsibility. We have an interest, in addition to whatever values or moral concerns might be at stake, in stopping the spread of this very extreme and threatening version of jihadi violence, whether it's in Iraq or in Syria, or elsewhere in the region. And I do think that we have made in Syria in the last year a very serious effort to coordinate better with our allies, including Turkey and including the Gulf Arabs and others, in order to distinguish between the extreme jihadi opposition to Bashar al-Assad's brutal, bloody dictatorship and the more moderate, more nationalist, more representative opposition inside Syria.
David Pollock, if I can just
in Iraq as well.
On what you're talking there is pick up on something that Robert Frost brought out, and that is allegations of Saudi's involvement in the very elements that the US says it is opposed to at this particular point. If there is some validity to this, then surely the US has a duty to engage its erstwhile ally, the Saudi Arabians, in terms of bringing some solution to the crisis in Syria and in what has become the wider battlefield.
Yes, that's right. And I think that's exactly what President Obama did when he visited Saudi Arabia a few months ago. And so I see that what we have is a US policy that rather late in the day tried to correct some of the mistakes of our own friends in the region. And unfortunately, it now looks in Iraq that this was a bit late, actually, and that these extreme jihadi elements that in the past did get Saudi support have taken on a life of their own today, even without that continuing support from the Saudis.
Robert Fisk, I want to pick up on something that you mentioned almost in passing, but is an absolutely vital factor in all of this: Iran. You said that Iran is deeply concerned. Iran now securing its borders, it is said, obviously meetings of the senior Iranian leaders about what to do about the situation right on their doorstep. Is this a wild card in this ongoing crisis?
There aren't any wild cards, Mike. I think what's going on is this. The Saudis, by the way, are still fully funding the jihadis, as are many businessmen in Kuwait. I've just been in Kuwait after Aleppo and talking to senior financial officials there. The fact of the matter is that what we're seeing is a kind of ghastly, ghostly repeat of the Iran-Iraq war. We're backing all sides. There are a lot of people who are very happy to see the Saudis and the jihadis fighting the Shiites, to hope that Iran, here's your Iran question, comes in, perhaps with men on the ground to help Maliki's government. We've already got 2,000 Iranian Revolutionary Guards, and recently, by the way, some Afghan Shiites on the side of Assad's forces inside Syria. What we're seeing is a sort of collection of powers, which includes Russia probably, America almost certainly, quite happy to see the Sunni powers and the Shiite powers fighting each other, just as they did again in the 1988 war, when 1.5 million Muslims died. I think we're seeing the same kind of thing again. The Saudis are not going to take any advice from the Americans anymore. I don't think the Muslim Middle East is, and that's one of the problems for Washington. I think that the Saudis are dead set on trying to destroy Iran through Iraq, through Syria, and we're very happy to support the Israeli war with Hezbollah in 2006. This is about Iran versus the rest, with us sitting on the sidelines and probably arming both sides.
Well, Harlan Solmaz-Türk, Iran versus the rest in this particular struggle. Where is Turkey in this? Is it standing alone, watching, deciding what side to come down on? Is it looking for its own opportunities in this completely messy crisis?
Look, we all have been in this business for quite a long time. So we know how we came into this situation. The trouble is, we are still not prepared to accept some others as legitimate players to find a way out of this messy crisis. The Iranian president was here in Ankara the other day, and this was the first official visit by an Iranian president to Turkey. And again, he insisted in challenging the fundamental secular dimension of political regime in Turkey by refusing visiting Kemal Atatürk's mausoleum in Ankara. My point is, Iran is the same old Iran we always knew. So we need to be careful about Iran, and including Iran as a player in this game. Other than that, I'm afraid I'm not very optimistic in terms of Turkish position, because the Turkish government has already become part of the internal war, civil war in Syria, part of the internal political struggle, political fight, sectarian fight within within Iraq. And as we have so many grave problems and increasing tension with Kurds of the region, I hesitate to invite the Turkish government to adopt how can I say, a more active role. I would recommend a careful course of action.
Well, little optimism and all the fault lines in the region being severely stressed. Thanks to my guests, Halden Somers-Turk, Robert Fisk, and David Pollock. And to add your voice to this discussion, you can find us at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story or go to @AJ Inside Story on Twitter. I'm Mike Hanna. Thanks for watching and goodbye for now.